Alright, what's up, Dragon Brood? It's that time of year, because we have another set releasing, and this time it is Wilds of Eldraine, which means we're going to talk about my top 10 favorite cards out of this set. Let's get started. Coming in at number 10 is Virtue of Loyalty. Now, I think a couple of Virtues are probably going to show up on my top 10, but this one's actually particularly good because it has two sides that are both excellent. Because you can just use the adventure to make a 2/2, which is fine. Also happens to be a knight, and knights are a thing in this set, so that could be a thing already. But then the other side is like at the end of every turn, you just get to put a +1/+1 on everything you have. And on top of that, for whatever reason, you get to untap them. Now, this probably has just okay applications in 60 card Magic, but it's the type of card that randomly, usually, when you have something that costs 5 mana, you can't really play more than a couple of them. But in this case, you could actually play 4 of them if you wanted to, because making a 2/2 is still fine. And you get to make it at instant speed. So yeah, overall, really good card. And this actually has some appeal for commander players as well, because we've seen a lot of cards that care about +1/+1 counters over the last couple of years, and there's some decks based around them. Hell, I have one myself that I'll probably be playing this card in. And even if I didn't, I might still play it anyway, because if you have a tokens deck or whatever, you get to put counters on everything and untap everything. Like, this card's just really good. Now, a little bit of a sneaky one that's made my list here is I get the Soul Cauldron. And this one's actually kind of tricky because it is cheap to cast, which we like. It also gets to be graveyard hate, targeted graveyard hate at that. So you can just choose a card every turn, so you can respond to them targeting something if you want to get rid of a thing, which is kind of nice. But then if you get rid of a creature, then you get to put a +1/+1 counter on something you control. And then on top of that, if that thing you removed has an activated ability, now creatures you control +1/+1 counters get to use those abilities. Now, this is interesting because you've now created a creature with the +1/+1 counter, but if you already have other things that have +1/+1s, well then they all get the option to have that ability. But even better is if you're playing it in a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters, then you just use this to get an extra counter every turn. This is really neat. It fills the void, or not even a void, but it just fills a spot in several different deck types, and the card itself could just be quality removal. Well, at least graveyard removal. So yeah, I'm kind of into this. Now, will it have a high ceiling? Probably not, but I think the situations where you want it are going to be very good. Now, this is one that almost didn't make my list initially, but the more I went back and looked through cards, it kind of got my attention. And this is talking about Will, Scion of Peace. Now, the reason I like this card is that it is just a reasonable creature, right? You pay 3 mana for a 2/3 with Vigilance, and it has an upside ability. But it's so easy to gain life, especially right now with everything making food, so you can just gain 3 life, or anything with lifelink, or just spells that outright gain life. I mean, we have the cards where you draw and then you gain life equal to cards in hand, like that's a thing you can do. But the thing here about Will is that it's so easy to gain life, and then it makes all of your other stuff cheaper for the turn after you tap it. And here's something to consider. This is the type of creature that could randomly show up in mid-rangey to control style decks, right? Like, it's a 2/4, and I think I said 2/3 a second ago, but it's a 2/4, so you have a reasonable sized body that you can block with. And it even has Vigilance. You can attack, block, use its ability, whatever you want to do. But think about this. Like, if you're able to cash in a food token, and then make, I don't know, some other big planeswalker or whatever, like, that could be pretty useful. Now, will it likely show up in those decks? Not really. It's probably going to show up in something else, but it's likely going to be some mid-rangey thing, most likely, and this card has significant upside. Randomly, though, it could have some possibilities where you're talking about trying to cast something like that Virtue of Loyalty we just talked about. Knocking off 3 mana from that could have some pretty high implications. Not a surprise that another Virtue made my list, and here we're going to talk about Virtue of Knowledge. This is another case of just liking both sides of this card, right? We have one side that actually lets you just copy an activated or triggered ability, which there's tons of those, so this could end up being very good, almost as a combo piece of sorts, depending on what you're trying to do. But then the actual enchantment itself, being able to just act as a Panharmonicon, effectively. When you have something come into play, it triggers, this copies it. Like, that's actually really good. And we have other cards that people like in Magic that they already play, and then this thing's going to be able to have another copy of that. And this is important when you're talking about something like Commander, where you get redundancy, right? You might like an ability, but you might only have one card that does it. Now you have 2 or 3. And this actually makes a lot of those decks more consistent. And this is actually fairly easy to cast as well, being 4 colorless and a blue, so not hard to splash into some decks. And the other side is actually very cheap to play as an instant, just a colorless and a blue mana. So yeah, I like a lot that this card's doing, and it can work with a lot of different things and possibly even open some different combos for stuff. But yeah, overall, really good card. Right, no lie, this one almost didn't make my list, but Moonshaker Cavalry. Yeah, mostly because I think I have a problem people calling this like the white crater hoof, but like I understand why it gets called that, but these aren't the same. There's a lot of reasons they're different. But that being said, this card's actually still really fun, really good. I don't know what the implications are for 60 card Magic. I have a feeling they're not that high. Like, you could play one just because if you wanted to splash it, or if you at least had some way to ramp up, then you go ahead and play one because this is a cool ramp card to draw and just try to close out the game. But generally speaking, this is probably going to be mostly relegated to being a commander card. Now, that being said, whenever your opponent gets it in commander, it's likely going to end the game. So, you know, it's still strong, really powerful. But yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see if these can be played in 60 card. Like maybe some Reanimator weird type deck, possibly. But yeah, not even sure if that's a good enough application for this card. It might just be in commander. But for commander, it is very strong. Next up, we have Beseech the Mirror. This card's particularly interesting because it's more expensive than a lot of tutors you would normally play, because it costs 4 mana, and even 3 of that has to be black. But if you sacrifice an artifact, artifact, enchantment, or token, that's it, those are the 3 things. Then, whenever you tutor up, if you get something that costs 4 or less, then you just get to cast it for free. So this is find the card and cast it in a lot of cases, which could be a ton of things, especially in older formats. There's a lot of things this can lead to. And if you're already playing a deck with black mana, then you go ahead and play a couple of copies of this because it's kind of all upside. And most of the old formats, you're not playing a bunch of stuff that costs more than 4 anyway. So yeah, this is actually just going to work out to do a lot of really good things. And no surprise that a lot of people are trying to get their hands on this card right now. And I expect we'll even see a couple of copies of this in Standard. I mean, in a way, this could actually be something like Shieldred's number 5 and 6 in your decks, if we're talking about the 4 mana Shieldred. So yeah, this could do a lot of things. It'll be interesting to see where this ends up in the long run, but here in the early goings, definitely a card people are trying to mess with. Next on my list is Werefox Bodyguard. I'm still a little confused why this is an elf, but somebody tried to explain that maybe it was an elf that got turned into a fox, which is even crazier. But that aside, the card is actually full of value. It's a 3 mana 2/2 with flash, so that already is helpful. Then you can exile a creature when it comes into play, and it does like the typical thing we see of cards like this. The interesting thing, though, is this can actually target your own things. This is not something we're able to do very often. So sometimes you can protect your best card in the event of some type of sweeper, or, you know, let's say your opponent wants to cast, well, really, we have a ton of sweepers. I was just going to pick one, but there's tons. Sunfall, for example. You flash this in, you can protect your own thing. This dies, you get your other thing back. Also, if something happens where they're going to kill it randomly anyway, you can then just pay 2 mana and get 2 life out of it. So lots of cool stuff this card does, and the fact that it has flash is really nice. And it happens to be a knight and an elf, so there's a chance it fits into those 2 types of builds if you're building those. So like a lot of what this card is doing, but it may even just be, you know, Brutal Cathar's number 5 and 6 in some decks. I don't really know where it's going to end up yet, but I do actually like this card quite a bit. Now, this card's amusing because I feel like it went under the radar for a lot of people, but Hildas Crown of Winter. This card's actually really sweet. Now, any of you old school players are going to look at this and be like, hey, isn't it just like Icy Manipulator? Like, well, very much so. That in the fact that you can play it for 3 mana, you can pay 1, tap something down. And if you want to tap something on your turn, it actually doesn't cost you anything, which is a nice added benefit if you're just trying to punch through with 1 creature or something. But it has a whole other line of text that I think makes this card so much better. And that's paying 3, sacrifice it, draw a card for each tapped creature your opponents control. There's some words here we need to pay attention to. That it's each tapped creature and its opponents, plural. So if you wait until this player attacks that player, maybe this player attacked here to try to gain some life, this player actually is attacking you with 3 creatures, and then you go ahead and blow this up, and you're going to draw like 8 cards, 10 cards. Like, even in just standard matches, like if you have this out and you're looking for a sweeper where your opponent attacks with 3/4/1/1s, you're like, great, I'll just go ahead and draw 4, take the damage, see if I find what I need to just close this game out. Like, this card actually has some reasonable upside, surprisingly. And it's one that I could see how people could easily overlook this, but it's probably going to end up getting some play as a 1 or 2 of in several lists. Stroke of Midnight is a very interesting card, not because of particularly what it does, which is basically remove any non-land permanent, and then its controller gets a 1/1, which is sweet. And you can use it on your own things as well, so if you randomly need to produce a blocker or some such, there is that. And it does create a human token, so relevant. That aside, we're in a world where we have just a bunch of really good spot removal. So I'm not sure what decks this particularly goes in over other things, but if you want kind of a catch-all removal, and maybe you're playing a hyper aggro type deck, then this card actually becomes somewhat viable, because right now we're trying some odds and ends here or there to try to fill up some gaps, maybe to remove some planeswalkers or to kill creatures. But if you could just have a card that does that all the time to everything and at instant speed, this is pretty good. Even better that it's an uncommon, so it shouldn't be too hard for people to craft or buy to put into lists. And it's probably going to end up being one of those uncommons that down the road is going to be somewhere between $1.50, $2. So yeah, this is going to definitely get some play in a card we're all going to have to look out for whenever we're playing. And before we get to the last card, I kind of want to know which ones y'all are really hyped about, right? Is there something you're excited to see that maybe I haven't mentioned so far? Or do you think any of my picks are crazy? I'm always curious what y'all think. But my last card on the list, Mosswood Dreadnite. Like, now, this card immediately doesn't look super exciting, right? You look and say, well, it's a 2-mana 3/2, and that's kind of cool, and randomly it's a green knight, and that's kind of neat. Does happen to be a human, which is relevant, and it has a pretty good adventure. Now, the adventure is a sorcery, but it's lose a life, draw a card, which, if you're playing a creature deck, a lot of times you don't have many ways to draw cards, so this is kind of nice, right? It can go into a 3-color humans deck, it can go into just a Golgari aggro list. This card is actually very quality, and you're not worried about playing this on turn 2 and it dying to something like Cut Down, because it has the fantastic ability that when it dies until the end of your next turn, you can just play the adventure again, which is amazing because you play the adventure and now means you have a chance to play the creature again. It's like a knight that just doesn't die. Like, this card actually can show up in more lists than I think we're even thinking about right now. And there's so many things that generate treasure and search for lands, and we have so many multi-lands that you don't even have to be hard on the black mana. You could be playing some mono green or green red deck that just happens to have other mana available, and this card becomes a viable choice to play in your list. I actually really dig this card, and doesn't surprise me that people are just now starting to catch on to how good this card could actually be. But like I said, let me know in the comments how you feel about this set, these cards, my choices, and if you're new to Magic and you're thinking about playing this on Arena, I have a video you should check out right here.